vu is part of the temporal lobe aura, and indeed, having subsequently then read up about it and spoken to epileptic specialists in the States, particularly a guy called Stephen Schachter, this is very much the case, that they know that it's part of the pre-seizure aura, and you know that you're going to have a seizure if you have déjà vus. So déjà vu does seem to be linked in some way or other. But Margaret's discussion with me was so serendipitous that it was untrue, because it suddenly sent me right off into temporal lobe epilepsy as a phenomenon. What is it all about? What is happening? And that's when the break started to happen. Now this is one of many paintings that Stephen Schachter has up on his website. And it's a painting done by a temporal lobe epileptic, trying to convey their temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, as you can see, this person has painted their head, and inside their head there's something else coming out the head. And it is again because temporal lobe epileptics, many of them, believe they are two people. There is a guy called Myron Dial, who's an American artist, who's read my book and is on my blog site, and we're in regular contact. And Myron has sent me the manuscripts of his forthcoming book. Myron has somebody in his head that he shared his life with, that he calls Caron. Caron does his paintings for him. Caron writes poetry for him. Caron is part of him. And as he said, he's my own higher self. He talks to me all the time. So I was thinking that the whole thing of this idea, so at the moment we seem to have some kind of theme going on here. We have the idea of something else in our heads. We have the idea of temporal lobe epilepsy and a linking with temporal lobe epilepsy. So I started looking more into temporal lobe epilepsy, and indeed I've done so for my next book, and I've come across around about 145 historical figures that either were diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy or it has been suspected at TLE. And here's a collection of, just because they're quite interesting characters. We have Alfred Lord Tennyson at the top here. And if you're aware that Tennyson was a temporal lobe epileptic and that TLE tends to manifest itself as déjà vus, and you look at a lot of Tennyson's poetry, he's writing about déjà vu all the time. It's one of his themes, it's the idea of time and being here before in some time or place. You have Fyodor Dostoevsky in the other corner. Now, although Dostoevsky never wrote any non-fiction, in effect many of his novels, as you're probably aware, were profoundly autobiographical. One particular novel, The Idiot, there is a sequence where the central character is put in front of a firing squad, and it's a mock execution. That actually happened to Dostoevsky. He was part of something called the Petroshky Circle that tried to assassinate, I think it was Tsar Alexander I, and they put him through a mock execution. In the book, he has a very vivid description of the character, the main character, standing in front of the firing squad. He's waiting, he falls out of time, and he has sufficient time to count the number of tiles, I think, on the building opposite in the final seconds of his life. Which reminded me profoundly of what Margaret said happened to her. Again, it's the same kind of idea of falling out of time. So Walter Scott in the bottom corner here amazed me when I discovered that his novel Lucy Lammermoor was dictated while he was in a fever in one night to his secretary. When he woke up this morning, he remembered nothing about that. Not one of his more famous novels, but I know that Donizetti did an opera about it. The guys down here are less known. They are Émile and Jules Goncourt, who were French ultra-realist writers in the 1850s. Both of these guys had profound temporal lobe epilepsy. And Jules Goncourt wrote the most amazing quotation. This is the second thing I ask you to bear in mind. The first one was the fact about the falling out of time and how long my friend Margaret could have been away. And this is the second one. Jules Goncourt turned around and said that life is a nothing between two epileptic seizures. Bear that one in mind. And the final one in the middle is somebody that I don't know has ever been formally diagnosed with TLE, but fascinates me nonetheless, and I have a whole chapter on him in my next book, and it's Rudyard Kipling. Kipling, in his autobiography, Something of Me, categorically claims that most, if not all of his short stories and some of his novels were influenced not by himself, but by a being in his head. And this being he called his daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N. And the daemon used to tell him which stories to write and how he'd write them. And one classic example was he was walking one day and the daemon suddenly manifested itself and said to him, "We need to write a story about the Norman invasions." And he turned around and Kipling said, "That sounds like an interesting idea, yeah, we'll do that." So he started drafting the story, and while he was drafting it, the daemon was popping in and making suggestions. And at one stage, Kipling had placed the two characters, the story, the adventure story was called The Old Men of Pevensey. And he placed the two old men of Pevensey in one of the towers in Pevensey Castle. And he got them trapped there because the invading Norman troops had surrounded the castle and they had a treasure. And he needed to get the treasure out in some way. So the daemon turns around to him and said, "I'll tell you what we can do. Let's make out there's a sea well in the wall. And then they can climb down the sea well and they can escape." Kipling turned round to his daemon and said, "Yeah, that's all well and good, but there isn't a tower, there isn't a sea well in Pevensey Castle, it's not going to work." And the daemon turned round to him and said, "Well, just go with it anyway. You know, it's fiction, go with it." 15 or so years later, after the short story had been written, they did excavations in Pevensey Castle, and guess what? There was a sea well in exactly the point that his daemon told him there was going to be a sea well. Don't take my word for that, it's taken literally from his autobiography, because he has a whole section on his creative process. That is one of 4 or 5 examples he gives of what he terms demonic precognition. 2 other stories are even more amazing, but I particularly like that one because it's quite succinct. So clearly there's something odd going on with people who have TLE. In fact, recently I've discovered, there was an article in New Scientist that was pointing out that another famous person with TLE, Vincent van Gogh, is painting Starry, Starry Night. It seems he was painting cosmic waves. His level of perception was such that he wasn't seeing normal light, which I find fascinating as to what was going on there. So TLE does seem to be something quite strange about it. So I needed to know exactly what it was that made TLE so peculiar. And as I started searching and I was talking to more and more people, I came across a paper written by a guy called Carl Janssen at the Maudsley Hospital, indeed an associate of Peter Fenwick. And Carl Janssen has come up with a wonderful theory about near-death experience. And what he's done is he's realised that the neurotransmitter glutamate, which is the major neurotransmitter in the brain, indeed the major neurotransmitter in the temporal lobes. I guess you all know what neurotransmitter is within the brain. Each cell of the brain, each neuron doesn't touch, and depending upon the signal and how the signal goes across a particular chemical is cut across the synaptic gap, which is why how painkillers work and things. So the neurotransmitters can change our mood in different ways. There are endogenous neurotransmitters that are created by the body, and there are external neurotransmitters that can affect the brain in one way or another. And that's exactly what these two are, because glutamate is an internal endogenous neurotransmitter, whereas they found that there is another drug called ketamine, which is very similar in structure to glutamate, and in fact can reproduce a lot of the effects that glutamate does in the brain. Because one of the things that it is known is in times of extreme stress, glutamate floods the brain. Extreme stress can also mean when you're about to die, because you can't think of anything more stressful than realising you're going to die. So what Carl Janssen has done is he has given ketamine, and he has been able to reproduce most of the near-death experience phenomenon. The feeling of floating above the body, the feeling of going down a tunnel, the feeling of a sensed presence that Persinger reproduced at Sudbury. So he is clearly sure that glutamate brings about the near-death experience. The interesting thing is that glutamate is also something that brings about elements of temporal lobe epilepsy as well. So clearly there is a link between near-death experience and temporal lobe epilepsy. In fact, we're talking possibly about the same phenomenon. So what does that mean? Well, I argue something that I call cheating the ferryman, which was the original title of the book. And by cheating the ferryman, I argue that something very peculiar happens to the brain at the point of death.